Picture this: a Saturday morning in January 2026. Most Americans are waking up, pouring coffee, scrolling through their phones. And then the news breaks. United States Special Forces have landed in Caracas, Venezuela. The president has been captured. Within hours, President Trump stands before cameras, declaring that America will now run Venezuela and take control of its oil infrastructure. The media explodes with coverage. Talking heads debate the legality, the morality, the geopolitical ramifications. But almost no one is asking the question that actually matters. Why did the United States just invade a country whose entire economy produces less oil than Texas alone? The answer has nothing to do with Nicolas Maduro. It has nothing to do with democracy or human rights or even regional stability. The answer is buried in the architecture of the global financial system, in a 50-year-old deal that has been quietly unraveling, and in a simple, terrifying fact that keeps Treasury officials awake at night. Venezuela proved you can sell oil without using dollars. And once that proof exists, once that example is out in the world for others to see and copy, the entire foundation of American economic power begins to crack. Today, we are going to trace how one struggling South American nation became the most dangerous threat to US financial dominance. We are going to expose the hidden system that has allowed America to print money without consequence for half a century. And we are going to reveal why what happened in Caracas is not the end of a crisis, but the beginning of a much larger collapse that will reshape the global economy in ways most people cannot yet imagine. This is the story of the petrodollar's death, and Venezuela is where the autopsy begins. Let's start with a mystery that most people never think about. Why can the United States run trillion-dollar deficits year after year without collapsing? Why can the Federal Reserve print trillions of dollars during a pandemic without triggering Zimbabwe-style hyperinflation? Why does the world keep lending money to a country that is $38 trillion in debt? The answer is not American innovation, or productivity, or democratic values. The answer is oil. In 1971, President Richard Nixon did something that would normally destroy a currency. He ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. For decades, the dollar had been backed by a promise: bring us your dollars and we will give you gold. That promise kept the dollar stable, trustworthy, predictable. Nixon broke that promise. Suddenly, the dollar was backed by nothing except faith in the United States government. This should have been catastrophic. Currencies without backing typically collapse. People lose confidence, start dumping the currency, and hyperinflation sets in. But Nixon and his advisors, particularly Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, understood that they needed to replace gold with something else. They needed a reason for the world to keep holding dollars even without the gold backing. They found that reason in Saudi Arabia. In 1974, Kissinger negotiated a deal that would define the next 5 decades of global economics. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars. Every barrel sold, regardless of the buyer, would be denominated in American currency. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection, advanced weapons, and security guarantees to the Saudi kingdom. But there was a second part to the deal, less discussed but equally important. Saudi Arabia would take those oil revenues and recycle them back into US Treasury bonds. This was genius, diabolical genius. Because oil is not optional. Every industrialized nation needs it. Japan needs it. Germany needs it. China needs it. Brazil needs it. To buy that oil, they first need to acquire dollars. Massive quantities of dollars. They need to hold dollar reserves to ensure they can always purchase energy. This creates what economists call artificial demand. The dollar is needed not because America produces the best goods or runs the most efficient economy, but because it is the only way to buy the one commodity that powers modern civilization. When Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations followed suit, pricing all oil in dollars, they essentially forced the entire world onto a dollar standard. Every central bank needed dollar reserves. Every international trade required dollar exchanges. The greenback became unavoidable. The implications are staggering. The United States can print money to fund wars, bail out banks, send stimulus checks, build aircraft carriers. And the inflation from all that money creation gets exported globally. When America expands its money supply, prices rise in Mumbai and Jakarta and Lagos. Those countries absorb the cost, while America enjoys the benefit of cheap financing. This is what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called the exorbitant privilege. The United States can borrow at artificially low rates because there is always demand for dollars. Treasury bonds are considered the safest investment on earth, not because America's finances are sound, they manifestly are not, but because everyone needs dollars, and treasury bonds are how you park those dollars. They are the bedrock of the system. For 50 years, this machine hummed along beautifully. The dollar's share of global reserves reached 73% in 2000. The United States accumulated debt without consequence. Saudi Arabia stayed loyal. OPEC followed the script. And anyone who tried to challenge the system was crushed, either economically through sanctions or, in extreme cases, militarily. But machines break down. Systems corrode. And by 2025, the petrodollar machine was showing catastrophic stress fractures. The first major crack appeared not in an oil field, but in a financial decision made in Washington. In 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Think about that for a moment. Russia had accumulated hundreds of billions of dollars as insurance against economic shocks. They held those reserves in dollar assets following the global playbook. And with the stroke of a pen, those assets became inaccessible. This was unprecedented. Sanctions are common. Trade restrictions are routine. But seizing the actual reserve holdings of a major nation's central bank, that broke an unspoken rule of the global financial system. Your reserves were supposed to be sacred, even if your government was hostile to Western interests. Every finance minister and central bank governor in the world watched this happen and drew the same conclusion. Dollar reserves are not safe. They are conditional. They exist only as long as Washington approves of your policies. The moment you become inconvenient, your savings can evaporate. The implications rippled outward immediately. If Russian reserves could be frozen, so could Chinese reserves, or Saudi reserves, or Indian reserves. Holding dollars was no longer just an economic calculation. It was a political vulnerability. You were essentially giving Washington a remote detonator attached to your national savings account. The response was predictable. Countries started diversifying. Gold purchases by central banks surged to levels not seen since World War II. The dollar's share of global reserves began declining, falling from 73% in 2000 to roughly 56% by early 2025. Currency swap agreements proliferated as nations sought ways to trade without using dollars as an intermediary. But these were defensive moves, workarounds within the existing system. The real threat would come from someone proving that you could operate completely outside the system. Someone showing that the petrodollar was not just weakening, but actually optional. That someone was Venezuela. Venezuela did not set out to destroy the petrodollar. The country stumbled into that role through a combination of economic collapse, American hostility, and desperate improvisation. But stumble or not, by 2025, Venezuela had become the most dangerous nation on earth to US financial interests. Not because of its military, not because of its ideology, but because of what it proved was possible. Start with the basics. Venezuela possesses 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That is more than Saudi Arabia, more than any other nation on the planet. 17% of all known reserves sit beneath Venezuelan soil. The oil is heavy crude, thick and difficult to extract, but it is exactly what US Gulf Coast refineries were designed to process decades ago. Venezuela should be one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America. Instead, by 2019, it was in freefall. Years of corruption, mismanagement, and plummeting oil prices had destroyed the economy. Hyperinflation made the currency worthless. Millions of citizens fled the country. Infrastructure crumbled. Production collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to barely 800,000 barrels by 2020. The United States, seeing an opportunity to remove the hostile Maduro government, imposed sanctions designed to strangle the Venezuelan economy. Washington froze PDVSA's assets, banned Americans from doing business with the state oil company, recognized an opposition leader as the legitimate president, and put a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. The strategy was simple. Economic starvation would trigger regime collapse. But something unexpected happened. Venezuela did not collapse. It mutated. With Western markets closed, Venezuela turned east. China, which had been lending to Venezuela for years through oil-backed loans, became the primary buyer. And here is where the story gets interesting. Those oil sales stopped being denominated in dollars. By 2018, 100% of Venezuelan oil exports were going to China, and those transactions were being settled in Chinese yuan. Venezuela had no choice. Selling in dollars meant using the US-controlled banking system, which would immediately freeze the transactions. So Venezuela, China, and the network of traders and shippers connecting them built an entirely new infrastructure. Shadow fleet tankers with transponders turned off. Ship-to-ship transfers in international waters to obscure the oil's origin. Payments routed through cryptocurrency stablecoins like USDT to bypass traditional banking. Currency swaps that converted yuan to other assets without ever touching dollars. It was crude, inefficient, and operated at the margins. But it worked. Venezuela continued producing oil. China continued receiving energy, and not a single dollar changed hands. The oil flowed, the country survived, the system functioned. And suddenly, the petrodollar looked optional. Now, defenders of the dollar system will point out that Venezuela is a mess. Production remains far below historical levels. The infrastructure is decaying. The economy is in shambles. This is true. But that is precisely what makes Venezuela so dangerous to Washington. If a country under unprecedented sanctions, with a collapsing economy and crumbling infrastructure, can still sell oil without using dollars, what does that say about stronger, more stable nations? If Venezuela can do it, then so can Colombia, so can Ecuador, so can Brazil. And if enough nations conclude that yuan or euros or even a basket of currencies work just as well as dollars for energy transactions, then the entire artificial demand structure supporting the dollar collapses. Venezuela became a proof of concept, a working demonstration that the petrodollar is not a law of physics. It is a convention, and conventions can change. In November 2025, an event occurred that should have dominated financial news, but was largely ignored by mainstream outlets. China issued $4 billion in US dollar-denominated bonds in Hong Kong. This was routine. Governments issue bonds constantly. What was not routine was the response. The order book came back at $118 billion, 30 times oversubscribed. Investors were practically fighting to lend money to China. But here is the detail that should terrify American policymakers. Those Chinese bonds began trading at lower yields than equivalent US Treasury bonds. Read that again slowly. Global investors were accepting lower returns on Chinese government debt than on American government debt. This, despite China having a lower credit rating. This, despite China being labelled America's greatest strategic rival. The smart money, the institutional investors who move billions around the world, were signalling that they trusted Beijing more than Washington. This is catastrophic for the petrodollar narrative. The entire system rests on one assumption. US Treasury bonds are the safest asset on Earth. They are considered risk-free, not because America's balance sheet is healthy, it manifestly is not, but because everyone needs dollars, and treasuries are how you hold those dollars. They are the bedrock of the system. But if investors prefer Chinese bonds even at lower yields, it means that assumption is breaking. It means the world is preparing for a future where dollar dominance is not guaranteed. And when faith in a fiat currency system begins to crack, the crack widens rapidly. Venezuela's example was now validated by market signals. Countries were not just watching Venezuela survive outside the dollar system. They were watching China emerge as a credible alternative center of economic gravity. The question was no longer whether the petrodollar would weaken. The question was how fast the transition would occur, and that is when Washington decided it could not wait any longer. The military operation in January 2026 was presented as a response to Venezuelan authoritarianism, human rights abuses, or drug trafficking, depending on which official you asked. But the timing and the aftermath reveal the real motivation. Consider the context. The US Strategic Petroleum Reserve had been drained to its lowest level since the 1980s. Years of releasing oil to suppress gasoline prices and manage inflation had depleted the emergency stockpile. American refineries needed Venezuelan heavy crude. Diesel supplies were tight. The entire logistics infrastructure of the US economy was becoming more expensive to operate without access to that specific type of oil. Meanwhile, that oil was flowing to China at roughly 600,000 barrels per day, about 4% of China's total crude imports. Every barrel represented not just energy, but validation of the yuan-based trading system. Venezuela had also become a partner nation in BRICS in 2024, giving it access to the new development bank, alternative payment systems, and diplomatic protection from the bloc's members. From Washington's perspective, this was intolerable. Not because Maduro was particularly powerful or threatening, but because the example was spreading. Other Latin American nations were watching. The BRICS bloc was expanding. The entire Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Americas are the US sphere of influence, was being eroded not by tanks and troops, but by currency swaps and oil for yuan contracts. So the United States did what declining empires do when diplomatic and economic pressure fails. It used force. The raid was swift and decisive. Maduro was captured. Key facilities were struck. And Trump's statement afterward was remarkably candid. The United States would run Venezuela. American oil companies would invest billions to rebuild infrastructure. The oil would flow north, priced in dollars, sold to American buyers. This was not regime change in service of democracy. This was a corporate takeover. Venezuela had defaulted on the dollar system, and the United States was foreclosing on the collateral. Within days, Trump announced that Venezuela would transfer between 30 and 50 million barrels of seized oil to the United States, to be sold at market prices with proceeds controlled by Washington. The message to other nations was unmistakable. If you attempt to operate outside the dollar system, we will take your resources by force. But here is where the strategy reveals its desperation. If the petrodollar system was strong and stable, military intervention in a country producing less than 1% of global oil would be absurd. Venezuela should be an irrelevant player. The fact that Washington felt compelled to invade demonstrates not strength, but profound vulnerability. The petrodollar does not need aircraft carriers and special forces to defend it unless it is on life support. Beijing's response to the Venezuela operation has been carefully calibrated. The Foreign Ministry issued strong condemnations about sovereignty and international law. Consultations with other BRICS members began immediately. But there were no threats of military retaliation, no immediate economic sanctions, no dumping of US Treasury holdings. This restraint is often mistaken for weakness. It is not. It is patience. China understands that this moment, painful as it is, accelerates the very trend Washington hopes to stop. Every nation watching the Venezuela operation now has confirmation that holding dollar assets makes you vulnerable to US coercion. Economic sovereignty requires not just alternative payment systems, but the ability to defend those systems from American intervention. The BRICS bloc, which now includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, represents 45% of the world's population and 35% of global GDP. These nations are not ideologically aligned. India and China have border disputes. Brazil and Russia have little in common culturally. But they share one unifying motivation: reducing vulnerability to dollar weaponization. The recent summit in Rio de Janeiro disappointed observers hoping for dramatic announcements of a BRICS currency. But that misunderstands the strategy. BRICS is not trying to replace the dollar with a new hegemonic currency. That would simply recreate the same vulnerabilities. Instead, they are building a multipolar system where trade can occur in any currency, where bilateral agreements bypass the need for a universal intermediary, and where no single nation can freeze or seize another's reserves. Russia and China now settle 99% of bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. Brazil and China trade directly in reals and yuan through currency swap agreements. India purchases Russian oil in rupees. The yuan now accounts for 42% of Russia's foreign transactions, up from just 4% in 2022. These are not proposals or pilot programs. These are functioning realities, processing billions of dollars worth of trade annually. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, now connects 1,467 indirect participants across 119 countries, linking 4,800 banks in 185 nations. It remains smaller than SWIFT, but its rapid expansion reflects growing confidence in yuan-based transactions. Project mBridge, a central bank digital currency platform involving China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE, offers another pathway for cross-border settlements that bypass the dollar entirely. The infrastructure is being built, the alternatives are emerging, and Venezuela, despite its capture, has already served its purpose. It proved the system is optional. The knowledge cannot be erased, the example cannot be eliminated, and every nation that witnessed the military intervention now understands that staying in the dollar system guarantees safety only until it does not. China can afford to be patient because time is on its side. America's debt continues mounting. The interest payments alone now exceed military spending. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent must sell $3 trillion in new debt this year. And the traditional buyers, Japan and Europe, are no longer buying. That leaves China. The nation Washington considers its greatest threat is also the nation Washington needs to keep funding its deficits. This is an unsustainable contradiction, and China knows it. Where does this end? The financial press loves to frame the question as binary. Will the dollar maintain dominance, or will it collapse? But reality is offering us three distinct possibilities, each with different timelines and consequences. The first path, and the most likely, is what we might call the slow bleed. This is the scenario we are currently on. The dollar remains the dominant global currency, but slowly loses market share. The 80% of oil transactions currently conducted in dollars gradually falls to 70%, then 60%. Central bank reserves continue diversifying. The yuan, euro, and gold capture larger shares. In this scenario, the petrodollar does not die so much as fade. America retains significant influence, but no longer enjoys exorbitant privilege. The cost of borrowing rises gradually. Deficit spending becomes more expensive. Living standards decline slowly enough that each generation blames different factors rather than recognizing the underlying structural shift. This is death by 1,000 cuts. Venezuela's intervention might buy 5 or 10 years, but the underlying mathematics are implacable. You cannot run $38 trillion in debt while your primary creditor is also your primary strategic rival. Eventually, the music stops. The second possibility is crisis acceleration. A single triggering event, a financial shock, a failed treasury auction, a major war, causes a rapid loss of confidence in dollar assets. The slow bleed becomes a hemorrhage. Central banks rush to dump treasuries. The dollar loses 30 or 40% of its value in months. The Federal Reserve must choose between allowing interest rates to skyrocket, which would crash the economy, or printing money to buy treasuries themselves, which would trigger inflation. In this scenario, the transition is compressed and chaotic. Trade grinds to a halt as currency values swing wildly. Credit markets freeze. The global economy enters a period of severe contraction that makes 2008 look mild. Eventually, a new system emerges, likely multipolar with multiple reserve currencies, but the transition costs are catastrophic. This is not the base case, but the probability is rising. Each intervention like Venezuela's makes the system more brittle. Each threat of 100% tariffs on BRICS nations adds pressure. At some point, the system stops bending and starts breaking. The third path, least likely but most desirable, is a managed transition. Global powers recognize that dollar dominance is ending and negotiate a transition to a new system. This might involve expanding the special drawing rights system at the IMF, creating a true international reserve asset, or establishing clear rules for multipolar currency arrangements. In this scenario, American living standards still decline. Debt still must be reduced, and painful adjustments still occur. But they happen over decades rather than months. The world avoids catastrophic disruption while accepting that no single currency should have the privileges the dollar has enjoyed. The Venezuela intervention makes this scenario less likely. You cannot negotiate a managed transition while simultaneously invading countries that operate outside your preferred system. Trust is a prerequisite for cooperation, and trust is exactly what Washington is destroying. Let's return to Venezuela and examine what happens next. The military operation was tactically successful. Maduro is in custody. The oil infrastructure is under US control. American companies, particularly Chevron, are positioned to invest in rebuilding production capacity. Estimates suggest production could return to 2 million barrels per day within several years, if sufficient capital flows in. But every element of this plan rests on unstable foundations. First, political stability. The Venezuelan people must accept a government installed by foreign military force. History suggests this rarely ends peacefully. Even if an opposition leader friendly to the United States takes power, the legitimacy crisis will persist. Armed resistance is likely, civil unrest is probable, and every barrel of oil flowing north will be seen by many Venezuelans as theft. Second, corporate trust. International oil companies remember what happened in 2007 when Hugo Chavez nationalized foreign assets. Billions of dollars in claims remain unpaid. ConocoPhillips' claims approach $10 billion. ExxonMobil's claims are around $2 billion. Why would these companies invest billions more in a country where the government has a history of seizing foreign property? Third, global perception. Every resource-rich nation in the global south just watched the United States invade Venezuela to secure access to oil that was being sold outside the dollar system. The lesson is clear. Your sovereignty is conditional. Your resources are not truly yours. And if you challenge dollar hegemony, you might face military intervention. This does not create loyalty, it creates fear. And fear drives nations into the arms of alternative power centers. China cannot invade the Americas. Russia cannot project force across the ocean. But they can offer trade, investment, and payment systems that do not come with the threat of regime change. The Venezuela operation might secure oil for the United States in the short term, but it has accelerated the long-term trend toward de-dollarization by confirming every suspicion about American intentions. Most people reading this or watching this video will not follow currency markets, central bank policies, or oil futures. These topics feel abstract, technical, distant from daily life. But the petrodollar's unraveling will touch every aspect of your economic existence, whether you understand the mechanisms or not. If you are American, prepare for a world where your dollar buys less. The exorbitant privilege has meant that Americans have enjoyed artificially cheap imports for decades. When the dollar weakens, those imports become expensive. Your electronics cost more. Your clothing costs more. The supply chains that deliver goods cheaply to your doorstep become more expensive at every node. Inflation will not be temporary. It will be structural. The Federal Reserve will face impossible choices. Raise interest rates to defend the dollar, and you crash the economy into recession. Keep rates low to support growth, and the dollar weakens further. There is no good option. Only choices about which form of pain to endure. Your government will lose the ability to borrow cheaply. The deficit spending that has funded everything from social security to aircraft carriers will become more constrained. Either taxes rise significantly, or benefits get cut, or both. The political fights over these choices will be brutal because there is no external enemy to blame. The crisis will be homegrown. If you are not American, you face a different set of challenges. The financial system will be less stable during the transition. Currency swings will create uncertainty for businesses. Trade will be more complex as bilateral agreements replace universal dollar transactions. But your nation will also gain autonomy. Policy decisions will be made in your capital, not in Washington. Your resources will be controlled by your government, not subject to American approval. The transition from dollar hegemony to a multipolar currency order is not optional. It is happening whether anyone wants it or not. The only question is whether it happens gradually, allowing time for adjustment, or rapidly, in a crisis that destroys value and disrupts lives. Venezuela forced this question into the open. The military intervention was Washington's answer. We will use force to maintain the system. But history suggests that force can delay transitions, not prevent them. Empires eventually adapt to reality, or they collapse under the weight of resisting it. There is a pattern to how dominant currencies lose their status. It happened to the Portuguese real. It happened to the Spanish dollar. It happened to the Dutch guilder. It happened to the British pound. The process takes decades, and it is never smooth. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency through the 19th and early 20th centuries. British naval power and the reach of the empire made the pound indispensable for global trade. But 2 world wars weakened Britain's position. The US dollar gradually took over. By the 1960s, the transition was complete. The pound still exists, Britain still has an economy, but the exorbitant privilege is gone. The dollar faces a similar trajectory. Not because of war, though conflicts certainly accelerate the process, but because of mathematics. You cannot be the world's reserve currency while running unsustainable deficits and weaponizing that currency against rivals. Eventually, the world builds alternatives. What makes this transition different and more dangerous is the speed. The pound's decline took 40 years. The dollar's decline might take 20 or 10 or even less if a crisis accelerates the process. Technology has compressed timelines. Capital moves instantly. Information spreads globally in seconds. The slow drift of previous transitions may not be available. Venezuela's role in this story is both catalyst and symbol. The country is not powerful enough to challenge the United States militarily. It is not wealthy enough to dictate terms economically. But it showed that the petrodollar is vulnerable. And in doing so, it marked a turning point that future historians will recognize as the moment when American financial dominance moved from declining to collapsing. The oil still flows from Venezuelan fields. The dollars still dominate global trade. The treasury auctions still clear. On the surface, nothing has changed. But beneath the surface, the foundations are cracking. The faith that sustained the system is being replaced by fear. And systems built on fear do not last. If you found value in this analysis, if you believe understanding these forces is essential to preparing for what comes next, then hit that subscribe button. Because the mainstream media is not going to explain the petrodollar to you. They will show you the spectacle, the military operation, the headlines about regime change. They will not show you the treasury auctions, the currency swap agreements, the slow accumulation of gold by central banks that signals a loss of faith in paper money. But those mechanisms determine your future. They decide whether your savings retain value. They determine whether your children inherit prosperity or crisis. And the only defense against what is coming is knowledge. The petrodollar era is ending, not because of ideology or morality or justice, because of mathematics. Because systems built on infinite debt and artificial demand eventually collapse under their own weight. Venezuela just showed us the collapse has begun. The question is no longer whether the dollar will lose its dominance. The question is whether you will be prepared when it does. So stay here, keep learning, and understand that the world you grew up in is not the world your children will inherit. Because Venezuela was not the end of this story. It was the beginning of the end. And the next chapter is already being written.